The great composer Benjamin Britten died in 1976, and his partner, the tenor Peter Pears, 10 years later in 1986. A long time ago now. I'm incredibly aware that there were many people, acquaintances and friends, people with whom they were on first-name terms, who were still alive and had more significant relationships with Britten and Pears than I did. But I do believe it's important to bear witness to great composers, because I know how much testimony of people who knew them fleshes out, improves, indeed enlightens people studying the composer in future years. So I offer my own memories gratefully and lovingly, whilst being only too aware that in comparison to others I was merely standing on the sidelines. I arrived in London in 1967 with a scholarship all the way from Africa to study at the Royal Academy of Music, piano and composition. Discovering London was fantastic, of course, but also the day-to-day differences. Libraries, for example, the fact that libraries not only contained books in this country, but scores that could be borrowed and LPs. A whole range of music became available to me that I had not been able to get to know in Africa. Amongst the names on the shelves, straight after Brahms, was Benjamin Britten. Of course, I knew that he was very famous, but I didn't know much about him, apart from a reference from an older musician in my home country that informed me that Benji Britt was one of those. There was a kind of disparagement in this, and when I later discovered that many other composers, Copland, Barber, Menotti, Bernstein, our own Michael Tippett, were also gay, it puzzled me why a certain disparagement came into people's voices when talking of Britten. It was very interesting for me to have access to this music. I took it home. I was boarding in a hostel, the Victoria League Hostel for Commonwealth Friendship. There was a portable gramophone there, and I literally hogged it and went through all of Britten's music, everything I could get my hands on, scores. And at the end of 2 years, I expect I could have passed a university viva, so much did I know about the composer, so deeply had I studied him. It was a kind of crash course, but it meant a great deal to me. And it meant a great deal to me because Britten was flagrant enough, open enough to live with another man, a singer, and not just any singer. His singer. He was the most famously out musician in the country. And in those less tolerant times, he took the flak for thousands who were living below the radar. Apart from being criticized as queer and pacifist, a conchy or lefty, Britten was also described as arrogant and touchy. It was said there was an exclusive court at Aldeburgh, and he was surrounded by adoring cliques. Homophobia added a prurient edge to these denunciations. Even I knew that the egocentric behavior of Richard Wagner in Bayreuth had been 10 times worse, but was largely excused because the only label hanging around Wagner's neck, the only label of otherness, was great German genius. As young and as inexperienced as I was, these remarks did not put me off Britten. On the contrary, If he was one of those, how much like him was I? I, who at 17 was lacking in every respect of life's experience, but had already read the sonnets of Shakespeare, the Leaves of Grass of Whitman, the Shropshire Lad of Houseman, and all of Mary Renault's novels. I was longing to know more about this composer. And as I say, I listened and listened. I knew whole passages by heart. I remember at a party in Kensington Gardens singing almost the whole prologue to the opera Peter Grimes by heart and strictly in unison with Oliver Knussen, who was 2 years younger and already a brilliant figure in music. Most of my contemporaries had gone on to worship at the temples of the avant-garde, Pierre Boulez in Paris and Karlheinz Stockhausen in Darmstadt. But my ignorance of their music was a temporary bliss. Catching up with the flood of Britain's music, also Noah's flood, of course, drowning in these borrowed library scores had been worth 100 composition lessons. I had composed songs of my own by this time, and I was lost in envy as to how Britain uncannily created apposite musical equivalents to verbal ideas. I didn't yet realize that Purcell and Franz Schubert had exactly the same kind of gift. But it was so important to an English speaker to learn how language and music were combined, how verbal images were reflected. And by working out how a brain like Britain's managed these equivalences was the best possible preparation for later on, when I began to study how verbal ideas in Lieder enriched the composer's imagination and how the composer's responses coming naturally from those verbal ideas gave us such liveliness and immediacy in the music. And in both the songs and operas of Britain, it was always recordings of the tenor Peter Pears that delivered revelations. The imagination and genius of what lay on the page was unfailingly matched by his singing. There were the gigantic operas, of course, but it was sometimes the miniatures which were more important, more alluring. Who could ever forget first hearing that phrase in the song Phrase in Les Illuminations that ends, et je danse.
J'ai tendu des cordes de clocher à clocher, des guirlandes de fenêtres à fenêtres, des chaînes d'or, d'étoile à étoile.
And then Antique, the song that followed. Neoclassical, Stravinsky had seemed to me something made in marble. But this music was sensuous, lean, erotic. as well as somehow chaste. I had read all about Verlaine and Rimbaud. Dorothy Parker once quipped that the trouble with Verlaine was that he was always chasing Rimbaud's. But this music was largely tonal. The 12 bars of B-flat major harmony had shocked Aaron Copland. He said of his own composition teacher, Nadia Boulanger, that she would never have allowed it. Benjamin Britten once said to me that Nadia Boulanger had ruined Aaron. Whatever the truth of this, it was still something utterly strange and new to see these textures, and much later to understand that one of the reasons Benjamin Britten was so rude about Nadia Boulanger was that she had absolutely disapproved of this particular work, Les Illuminations.
Gracieux fils de Paul, autour de ton front couronné de fleurs rectes et de blé, tes yeux des bourres précieuses remuent, tachés de lit brûlent, tes joues se creusent, tes crocs luisent, ta poitrine ressemble à une cithare, des tintements circulent dans tes bras blonds. Ton cœur bat dans ce ventre d'or, le double sexe promène à toi la en mouvant doucement cette cuisse, cette seconde cuisse, et cette jambe de gauche.
In 1968, I wrote the composer a fan letter. No doubt there were many such sent to him by those who did not just love the music, but also somehow regarded Aldborough as the city on the hill. For some of us, what was most remarkable was that something great and fruitful was happening there as a result of the love that dared to sing its name. I could scarcely believe it when I went down to the mailbox in the Victoria League hostel the next day and saw an envelope with Britten's handwriting. It had been a reply by return of post. The stamp, purely by chance, was a glorious one, Elizabeth I, and it wasn't lost on me that that had been sent by the composer of Gloriana. The gesture was extremely kind, but of course he was far too busy to see me. In 1969, I was granted an interview at the Red House. For me, it was nothing less than a pilgrimage. Considering that the Maltings had been burned down a few days before, I considered myself very lucky to have spent even a few minutes in the composer's company. And that seemed to be that. I sent a copy of my newly composed cello sonata to the Red House in 1970. Its receipt was acknowledged by the secretary, but I heard nothing more, of course. But it was the score of this work that was eventually to play an unexpected part in the story. In February 1971, I organized a concert at the Royal Academy of Music in honor of the 70th birthday of my composition professor, Alan Bush. Peter Pears, years earlier, had commissioned and sung a formidably difficult cycle, Voices of the Prophet. Bush had composed the music and Pears had given the first performance and recorded it. I cheekily wrote to the singer and proposed that he should come to London, take part in this concert, and of course, I didn't have a fee to offer him. Loyalty to old friends and generous willingness to take up unpaid challenges, these were among this singer's endearing characteristics, as I was later to learn. On the day of the performance at the Royal Academy of Music, I met Pears for the first time. He was a tall, imposing man with a kindly presence, in some ways younger than his 60 years in appearance. He always tried to retain a touch of the bohemianism of his youth, I think. In other ways, he was a real Edwardian. He'd been born just after the death of Edward VII in 1910. And there was a certain grandeur about Peter. In his wonderful spoken English, one heard the H in where. After shaking hands, he said to me, "I am charged with bringing you the greetings of the composer of the serenade." Well, I could scarcely believe that Britain had remembered me. That evening, as promised, Pears sang songs from the Alan Bush cycle with the composer at the piano.
Rouse up, O young men of the new age, set your foreheads against the ignorant hirelings, for we have hirelings in the camp, the court, and the university, who would, if they could, forever depress mental and prolong corporeal war. Believe Christ and his apostles, that there is a class of men whose sole delight is in destroying.
The great singer was kind enough to stay for the rest of the concert, and with my cellist, Jonathan Williams, I performed various rather difficult pieces of chamber music by Alan Bush, whose music, incidentally, can be marvelous, and I recommend the investigation of it. It was not long before I received a totally unexpected invitation to spend a weekend in Albury. I thought that perhaps Piers had found my playing at the concert not too bad. But on the whole, I think, or at least I thought at the time, that they were sorry for me. I was more or less an orphan in this country and had no relatives, no background. A summons to Balmoral could not have been more exciting for me, of course. But I'd been invited, actually, for a professional purpose. And as always, Britain was thinking ahead, but this was not yet revealed to me. My stay at the Red House was suddenly curtailed on Sunday morning when I was driven to the station. I must have been too full of irritating questions. My enthusiasm to be in that surrounding, my curiosity, the number of questions I had about works that had not yet been recorded. Well, I think it was all too tiring for everybody. I'd also annoyed the composer by haplessly partnering him in a game of croquet, and I'd never played croquet before. He was not amused to lose. That was a side of him, very competitive, but I did manage to make him smile by adapting an Auden quotation from the Spring Symphony. Out on the lawn I lie in bed, shame conspicuous on my head. On that visit, there was much talk of a project, and I was sworn to secrecy about it. Britain was working on a new opera. The subject was Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. A few months earlier, I had seen the Visconti film, but Britain hated the very idea of that film, and he never saw it. At the time, there were dire copyright issues brewing with Visconti. So, that first visit was not a success. And I was very surprised when I was invited to stay again. Apparently, I'd not failed the audition entirely. Bach's St. John Passion was being recorded at the Maltings at the time. On separate occasions, I remember Britain telling me how marvelously Piers was singing. And without him knowing about that compliment, Piers telling me how profoundly and how deeply Britain understood Bach's music. I also remember sitting in the back seat of the Elvis sports car as they drove to the beach. I was always asking questions, and the question this time was about Paul Bunyan, the operetta composed in New York, and there was neither score nor recording, and I was very curious about it. Peter said that he'd copied out the score by candlelight in America. And suddenly, forgetting me entirely, the pair began to sing a tune that was as yet unknown to me. A melody turning the clock back 30 years in their relationship. At that moment, as I sat there, looking at them as they looked at each other, they seemed inseparable, welded together in history. It was magical. It was only much later that I was able to identify that spontaneously sung tune as Tiny's song from Paul Bunyan.
Be quiet, you fools! Have you forgotten her mother's just died?
If I now use the first names of Britten and Peers, it's because I was invited to do so when a letter arrived signed Peter, don't you think, and Ben. I turned pages for the first rehearsals of the composer's last song cycle, Who Were These Children? The text is by the Scottish poet William Souttar. And the final song in the cycle, The Old Oak, the old oak, a tree 200 years old or more, and now Dún, down. A word repeated 5 times in the song, and I was very flattered that Ben asked me if I thought there was one too many Dúns, if I preferred only 4 times. And I said no, out of the conviction that the 5th time somehow conveyed the bitterness of realizing that all things had indeed come to an end. Things were coming to an end, certainly, but not quite yet. 8 Halliford Street, Islington, off the Essex Road, the home of Peter Peers's niece and his agent, Sue Phipps, her husband, Jack Phipps, and her son, Martin, had built next to it a wonderful studio, an annex, an elegant 1-bedroom extension with a music room. This was the London address of Britten and Peers, and it was there that I was present for the first run-through of the 4th canticle, Journey of the Magi. The words by T.S. Eliot, of course. Setting this text for 3 singers, well, there are 3 wise men, certainly, but simply setting the text for 3 singers is typical of one of those easy, appropriate ideas that Britten had, which very few people would otherwise have thought of. Obvious, except it wasn't so obvious until Britten did it. The singers arrived for the first rehearsal perfectly prepared, as you always had to be, as far as Britten was concerned. Peter Peers tenor, of course, the great baritone John Shirley Quirk, whose singing played such a large part in the last phase of Britten's life, and equally important in this phase of Britten's life, the great countertenor James Bowman. All of these were to be members of the cast of Death in Venice. I will never forget hearing the combination of these vocal timbres for the first time with the opening words, "A cold coming we had of it." How could it be that the sonority conveyed something icy and exotic, mysterious and Middle Eastern, all at the same time?
Worst time of the year for a journey. And such a long journey.
Another long journey, another long, cold journey, was to be the most enduring gift that Britten and Pears ever gave me. What had started for me as an epiphany regarding their gramophone recordings continued with further life-changing revelations. I was invited to the 1971 festival and was accommodated at the home of kind Mrs. McGill, whose son Ronan was also a friend of the composer. I was taken along, almost in a routine manner, to a performance at the Maltings of Franz Schubert's Winterreise. Might as well, I thought. Would have preferred it to be Britten's music, but okay. Winterreise. I'd always been more of a Beethoven player, and believe it or not, I knew far too little about Schubert's Lieder, rather more of the piano music. But from the first notes, all of us seated in the Maltings were aware that we were in the presence of something truly epic, a gigantic artistic event.
Eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus. Der Mai war mir gewogen mit manchem Blumenstrauß. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von Ehe. Das Mädchen sprach von Liebe, die Mutter gar von Ehe. Nun ist die Welt so trübe, der Weg gehüllt im Schnee. Nun ist die Welt so trübe, der Weg gehüllt im Schnee.
In that opening song of Winterreise, Gute Nacht, there's a great deal of minor key tonality. But in the last verse, the key changes from the minor to the major, a major key of sweetly remembered love. The simple change in a D minor chord, the addition of an F sharp to make the major key. It was the way the music changes into the major and the way that the voice comes in, the way that Peter Pears' voice was able to come in on a floated F sharp at the top of the stave. It was this major key of sweetness and infinite sadness that was my first view of the heavenly fields of Schubert's imagination.
Nicht stören, wer schar deine Ruh, sollst meinen Tritt nicht hören, sacht die Türe zu. Schreib ihm vorübergehen ans Tor die gute Nacht, damit du mögest sehen, an dich hab ich gedacht. Schreib ihm vorübergehen ans Tor der guten Nacht, damit du mögest sehen, an dich hab ich gedacht, an dich hab ich gedacht.
At the end of the concert in the Maltings, I emerged blinking into a summer sunset, so beautiful at that time of the year and in that part of Suffolk. This sudden and unexpected coup de foudre had made me forget about my ambitions of being a composer. I had fallen irrevocably in love with Schubert and above all with the undreamt of expressive possibilities of Lieder accompaniment. To follow Ben simply in that small way would be enough for me, should I be so lucky. Any compositional ability I did have could be put to better use in learning to understand the compositional choices of others, because that does play a part in how one plays, the understanding of what the composer is trying to achieve. It was around about this time that I realized that my cello sonata, lying somewhere in the Aubre vaults, had become of interest to Britain, not because of its musical content, but because of its competent penmanship. Imagine You are a great composer about to embark on an important opera, on an important theme, and the curiosity about it, even in the small circle that already know about the project, is enormous. What sort of music is Britain going to provide for this? A great composer like Britain has a great many people around him, very supportive publishers. And those publishers have a staff. And it is up to them to transfer the musical manuscripts into something readable, usable, before the act of printing takes place. It seems that in beginning Death in Venice, Britain was afraid of this wonderfully competent staff, the publishers, copyists who were themselves very good composers. He was afraid of being judged. He was afraid that they would think that what he was producing was rather thin gruel. How much better would it be to allow that music that he was writing to be seen only by a copyist, a young copyist without connections, a young copyist who would never ever judge the music to be wanting? Wouldn't it be better to make an arrangement for his music not to go to the publisher, but to be worked on by young Graham Johnson, whose cello sonata was neat enough to suggest that he could do the job? As I get older, I understand the vulnerabilities of people, the desire not to be judged as really being too old by younger contemporaries. It's understandable. I was the person who was going to spare him that fear, that sense of ill ease. I was told about this plan many months before I actually did any copying. And it was in the summer of 1971, before I returned to Zimbabwe to see my family for the first time in 4 years, that Britain had asked me to commit to doing something for him that had terrified me. It was not at all the something my mother had in mind when she informed me that my father had found out some shocking information about Mr. Britton, my new friend, from the local music dealer. Well, epic detective work, considering that there was no internet at the time. I remember giving a talk to the local music club in Salisbury, not yet Harare, about the Britten operas. It was at the home of a Great Britain devotee, Rhys Lewis, and indeed there were Great Britain devotees all around the world. When a woman in the audience asked me, "Well, I'm very interested that, Benjamin Britten's obviously a very great composer and all that, and I really like some of his music very much, but just on the personal level, I wonder why you could explain to me why he didn't get married, for Pete's sake." And I remember replying, "For Pete's sake, he didn't." On returning from Africa, I was not yet needed for the copying tasks. Britten made a working visit to Venice with his librettist, Mfanwe Piper. In the meantime, I scored a perfect hit with Britten on his birthday, perhaps my only one. I got him a peal of Persian camel bells. He wrote back, from the Red House Opera, the 24th of November, 1971. "My dear Graham, many warmest thanks for that fascinating, melodious present. It's hanging at the foot of the stairs, and every time one passes, a touch of the hand raises again the insoluble problem of that curious scale. The sound is very beautiful, but where did it come from? I can't connect that sound with camels. Those bells still hang at the foot of the stairs at the Red House. I was invited to stay for the New Year festivities welcoming in 1972. This was when the subject of Der Rosenkavalier came up at the dinner table. Fellow guests were Marion Thorpe and Jeremy Thorpe. Of course, Marion was a very important figure in Britain's life, the daughter of his first publisher, Erwin Stein. Well, the subject of Rosenkavalier came up, as I said, and Britten said that he couldn't bear the music. It made him physically ill. I begged to differ. The champagne somehow made me feisty. "What exactly do you like about it?" he asked. Well, it was the trio, of course, at the end of the opera. I remember singing the phrase, "Marie-Thérèse." These words that begin that sublime trio. "I'm very well aware of how the music goes," Britten said, "and I certainly don't need you to sing it to me." There was silence. Peter pumped the footbell that told the lovely Heather in the kitchen to bring in the next course. New Year's greetings were exchanged at 11 p.m. when Britten observed that it was midnight on the continent, and we all went to bed. He was no doubt impatient to get up and compose. I was devastated, of course, by this sudden lashing out. The next morning, New Year's Day 1972, Peter apologized to me for Ben's tetchiness. What the composer apparently disliked about the music was Old Man Strauss wallowing bloke-like in a sapphic sexual fantasy. But he didn't want to say so in front of Marion. Well, I could understand that about the first act, perhaps, and the music before the curtain goes up, which Britten was said to particularly detest. But the trio? Really? Perhaps because it was about aging and having to give up the young and the beautiful. And now I realize what enormous pressure the composer was under at this time in his life. Ill, a vast opera still in front of him, not knowing how it was going to go. Frightened, on edge. I bear absolutely no ill will. It was amazing to see the duopoly of Britten and Pears at work, Britten saying something and Pears acting as a kind of corrective, a sort of a good cop, bad cop aspect to their lives. Although, fascinatingly, there are many people who knew them both who found that the accent was on exactly the opposite direction. Pears as bad cop and Britten much more friendly. As for those who said that the Red House was probably a louche den of iniquity, I always felt it was an absolute place of great propriety, a bastion of middle-class morals. I'm certain that their lives were more complicated than that, perhaps also when they were younger. But Ben and Peter sensed that I had placed them on a pedestal in terms of their relationship, And in that respect, I was never disillusioned. I remember Peter once writing to me and encouraging me to lighten up. I think possibly he felt that I was far too idealistic. Don't work too hard, he wrote. Allow life to have its lyrical moments too. In March 1972, my application for funding from the Countess of Munster Musical Trust required a reference from a musician of standing. I can't remember how I ever dared to ask Ben to be that musician of standing, but apparently I did. Years afterwards, the Trust was kind enough to send me, unasked, a copy of the letter from the composer that they still had on their files. I truly had no idea that he thought so well of me at the time, and it was a very kind letter. But I was on the point of beginning to work extremely hard on the task that he had chosen for me a long time ago. It was in March, perhaps April 1972, that I was suddenly called into service as a copyist for Death in Venice. And the deadlines were very demanding and almost impossible. I was no professional copyist. I had no experience in this field, but I did my best, transferring piles of Britten's sketches and photocopy into a neat musical hand. I received screeds of instructions how to do so, page after page, from Britten's formidable musical assistant, Rosamund Strode. I should say here that Rosamund had so many tasks, had so much else to do. A remarkable woman, a remarkable musician, that this particular task was one that she was not able to do. That's why I was engaged. But she truly wanted to help me do it as well as I could. I simply couldn't assimilate all the requirements. There were special Faber and Faber requirements also. I wasn't quick enough. And it is part of the story, isn't it, that the sorcerer's apprentice makes a mess of things. For a little while, Britten's publisher Donald Mitchell had indulged the composer's mad whim about preparing the score in this way, but he also knew how to steer him into a more practical direction. After 3 or 4 weeks of work, Rosamund Strode was deputed to come to London to give me the chop. The task of making the music was to revert to Faber's music, suppressing my huge disappointment. Well, I was getting better. And yes, there was also a bit of this isn't fair. I knew that the only thing that would keep me from being cast into the wilderness, familiar to all those who had failed at Aldborough, was immediately write and express my sorrow for not having been good enough. As it happened, this letter exactly crossed with one I received from Britten. My dear Graham, I fear Rosamund's news to you this afternoon may be a bit of a shock, certainly a disappointment. She will have explained the problems, and to say how it was most fully discussed with Donald Mitchell. If it had been just among ourselves, it might have worked. But with hard-pressed repetiteurs, chorus members, having to use it, and then the reproduction of it for the stage staff, finally the copy for the printers, it might start terrible problems, virtually impossible to resolve. So I fear we must call it a day so far, but of course, if you still want to, we'd love you to work with Peter on the playing side of it as soon as he has time. This was a very kind letter. And of course, I wanted to work with Peter on the opera. I think I was enormously fortunate, and I also believe that Britten was very well aware that his desire for me to do this job in the first place had been a kind of folly. As it turned out, the people who worked with his music at Faber's were admirers, were supporters, and bit by bit, a wonderful opera, a great opera, was sent to them and properly transcribed. It was in the studio in Islington during 30 or so working sessions on Death in Venice that I experienced a great opera taking shape. Piers was 62, an age when many singers had already retired. Using constantly evolving die-line copies of the score, our usual routine was going through the roll, or of as much of it as had been already written, from start to finish. The passages that gave him the most trouble were those expanses of unaccompanied recitative, making up 20 or so pages in the score, in which the composer had pitched the notes, quasi parlando, in the manner of Schütz. On one occasion, when Peter seemed to make the same errors time after time in a single passage, substituting his notes for Britten's, I mooted, phoning the composer, to permit the substitution. The notes came more naturally. Piers was shocked at the very thought. "I can't do that," he said. "It's not my place, not what I'm here for. Let's do it again." There were other times when I noticed the same reverence, the same awareness that musical history was being made and that the lover, the partner, was a servant of the great composer first and foremost. In the middle of the day on these sessions, we'd usually take a break and went out to lunch in Islington, or perhaps Peter would rustle up something in the kitchenette. Living up to his reputation as a Renaissance man, Peter talked of Italian madrigals and English lute songs, painting and drawing, a great deal about poetry. Auden, a frequent and sometimes barbed topic of conversation. All those memories of America. Also, of course, Shakespeare, Eliot, and his friend Sylvia Townsend Warner. Countless others. There was lively chat, too, about a number of contemporary composers other than Britten, whose work Peter had commissioned. I once listed 33 composers' names in all. I was a young and insignificant beginner, and he probably felt freer to be less discreet, to discuss things with me that he would have been rather more guarded about with someone more senior in the profession. On one occasion, after we finished our rehearsal, our coaching session, we went into the West End to see David Story's The Changing Room. Peter was keen to hang out at some bohemian watering hole in Soho. I was inexperienced in terms of where one drank in Soho. There was little choice. Alarmingly few places to eat in those days. We ended up in a wimpy bar, which Peter rather gamely said reminded him of an American diner of the 1940s. "What you want to drink, love?" said the waitress. Piers, have you a nice Grave? Or perhaps a Chablis? The woman's face. We do have Horlicks, love. At other times, Peter was very overcome by news of Ben's deteriorating health. It was a medical situation that was seemingly leading only one way. The only question was when. Looking back now as someone older and more a man of the world, I profoundly regret my inability to have provided Peter with any meaningful support in return for what he was giving me. It was the memorizing of the role of Aschenbach, not the singing of it, that he found tricky, although the words that he invented to replace those in the libretto were sometimes better than the original. In the original, for example, the Venetian city fathers had seldom been so serious. And Peter spontaneously came up, seldom been so solicitous. And that word actually remained if Henry Piper changed it. The voice was remarkably youthful, more rounded indeed than when he himself was younger. All through his professional life, Piers had taken singing lessons as if in search of an unattainable holy grail. And in the last phase of his life, he'd found a new teacher by the name of Lucy Manen, who did give him a new lease of vocal life, and later an appetite to teach singing himself. The lower range of his instrument, not always his strength, and the resilient top were now seamlessly and freely connected. As I say, the lower range had more access to baritonal colors than ever before. And his control of dynamics, everything from fortes down to the most floated, ethereal pianissimos. Well, this was awe-inspiring. It was on this kind of form that he was later still able to conquer New York at the Metropolitan Opera in the role of Aschenbach. He was in his late 60s. The voice was never huge, but it was so well produced that it was audible in that large auditorium in a way that many other singers were not.
successful, honored, self-discipline my strength, routine the order of my days, imagination servant of my will.
My role in Aldeburgh now took on another facet. I was the sole pianist for the weekend at Aldeburgh in the summer of 1972, when Peter taught for the first time in the presence of a tent full of celebrities. I remember William Walton was there, and fresh from winning the Leeds piano competition, the great pianist Murray Pariah, who was later to partner Peter Pears in many recitals. The school was not yet built, so as I say, there was a tent construction built outside the Maltings. Gave the whole event rather a summery feel. Amongst the student tenors, both later famous, were Anthony Rolfe Johnson and Neil Mackie. The music to be taught was Purcell, Schubert, and Britten. As I was about to begin accompanying Winter Words, the Britten cycle, I noticed that the composer, who I'd spotted sitting in the back row, had slipped out. This was greatly to my relief, and I played with much greater relaxation without the thought of Ben peering from the back of the hall. To my surprise, the composer suddenly materialized afterwards, having listened to everything from behind a screen. His disappearance engineered specifically not to make me nervous and put me off. In this kind of way, when dealing with young people, Britten was truly endlessly imaginative and concerned. He was very complimentary to me, very encouraging. Perhaps he felt a little guilty about me and the copying episode. But he was very much making me feel that I had a right to be there, playing his music. He gave me one or two tips that I've never forgotten. Flashes of great kindness, flashes of temper. He never failed to astonish. Indeed, his whole life was like a brilliant and blinding flash in the musical firmament. After the tragic failure of his heart operation in April 1973, Ben slowly faded away from my sight, and I did not see him regularly. Occasionally he would appear in a wheelchair at the box in Aldborough to see something, visiting only for a few minutes and then being taken away. His appearances were almost incognito. He was working all the time and extraordinarily supported by a new member of the Britten team, the nurse Rita Thompson, who had worked in the heart hospital and had come to Aldborough to look after him full-time, and who became a very dear and important part, an unexpectedly important part of the entire Red House setup. In some ways, I got to know many things about Ben through conversations with Rita. She, who at this stage, and apart from Peter, probably knew him best of all. I received one or two letters from him, but the writing and the manner of them showed just how ill he was. Those Piers masterclasses became yearly events in the summer, and in 1973 I was joined as official accompanist by the magnificent Roger Vignals, far more experienced than I was at that stage. The Britten Piers School came into being. When Peter demonstrated in the masterclasses, students were open-mouthed with amazement. I don't mean only at his technical facility in terms of the singing, but at the total package of the man himself, with poetry linked to the music, so that, in a sense, words and music were linked together in an inevitable way that was unforgettable. It was the total package, masterly and magical, and because of his age and stature and experience, wise. The voice itself was just one of many things, serving and being served by everything else in his personality. Standing before us was a singer of operas, oratorios, and song cycles, but also a festival director, a librettist, a translator, a teacher, a connoisseur of fine art, the lover and champion of a great composer. When Peter began to sing, especially in this golden Indian summer of his career, all these attributes became one grand, all-encompassing, intensely focused thing. As he wrote about Kathleen Ferrier once, the voice is a person. And on the platform, it was Peter as a person who came together with Piers the singer in miraculous fashion. Towards the end of his life, Britten made a point of seeing friends one by one. A chat that was a thinly disguised farewell. I remember there was a party, a gathering in the garden of the Red House, and Rita came down and asked me to come upstairs for a few minutes. My short time together with Ben was perhaps 10 minutes at most. And I spent it attempting to refute his predictions that his music would soon be completely forgotten. But in truth, when I look back on those times and the fortunes of tonality versus atonality and serialism, there was much to be frightened of. It wasn't just the illness. It wasn't just a petulant desire to be reassured that he was a great composer. At that time, we didn't know, we couldn't envisage the world in which we now live, where melody is unquestionably, and tonality, a part of the varied compositional palettes that composers offer. I think he might have been amazed to know how well his operas have retained the stage. They are such well-made works of art. And I think he would be amazed to know how much his music is performed, and that there is still a thriving center of his music and a trust that the Red House is now a museum and that people can visit it. Many mainstream listeners have come face to face with awkward issues only because Britten's music has encouraged them to do so. He had a way of making people, nudging people, not pushing them, but nudging them to think outside the box. And his musical voice has been one that all sorts of people have come to love and admire. The smutty jokes no longer seem not only permissible, but even relevant. He's taken his place effortlessly. Britten's death in 1976 left Peter with a decade more to live. His bereavement was heart-wrenching to watch. I remember him attempting to sing Schubert's song, Die Taubenpost, and literally having to walk off the stage midway through. We kept in touch, of course. I was beginning to do a lot more work independent of opera, including Songmaker's Almanac. From time to time, I accompanied Peter at the Maltings and at the Wigmore. In 1978, there was a memorable Abraham and Isaac, together with Dame Janet Baker.
My son. on my day, that thou lovest the best of all. And in sacrifice offer him to me. Upon that hill there besides thee. I will that so it be. For that may to this mine intent, ever to be obedient. That son that thou to me hast sent, offer I will to thee. Thy bidding done shall be.
In the summer of 1980, the Songmaker's Almanac was invited to Aldeburgh to celebrate the 70th birthday of Peter Pears, and I devised a program appropriately. In 1819, Schubert had written a cantata with locally written words in honor of his great singer, Johann Michael Vogel. The singer Vogel had been a great operatic performer, and his various roles are mentioned in this cantata, so I thought it would be a good idea to ask my friend Eric Crozier, who had been librettist of Albert Herring, co-librettist of Billy Budd, to adapt the words of this Schubert cantata to encompass Peter's operatic roles. I remember a phrase of genius set to Schubert's dotted rhythms. The original German was Der Natur hast du entwandt, was die Kunst noch nicht verstand. And of those rhythms, and fitting that music, Eric Crozier wrote the words, Peter Grimes and Peter Pears had synonymous careers. Peter continued to sing, garnering some of the best critical notices of his entire career. But as if in defiance of the dying of the light, he planned to sing things that I thought were foolhardy for both him and the voice. I dared to write to him and say so. Concentrate on your wonderful school, I said. And it was his reply that brought our friendship of a decade full circle. And then he goes on to say, I must remind myself continually that our beautiful and model school is where I should mostly employ myself in future and be satisfied with Suffolk. Again, I see that as the humility of a great man. Peter gave a recital in this hall on the 4th of September 1980, the Queen Mother's 80th birthday. It was the last time I accompanied him, and the last time I think that he sung in this hall. Frank Bridges' song, Go Not Happy Day, was on the program, and it has a very difficult final high A for the tenor. I offered to transpose the song into A flat to make it easier. He agreed, yes, perhaps that would be better. But at the last minute, just as we came onto stage through these famous doors, he whispered to me, A major. It has to be A. The color of the song is A, not A flat. There he was, right to the end, thinking of the music first and not himself.
Go not happy day from the shining fields, go not happy day till the maiden yields. Rosy is the west, rosy is the south, roses are her cheeks and a rose her mouth. When the happy yes falters from her lips, pass and blush the news over glowing ships, over blowing seas, over seas at rest. Pass the happy news, blush it through the west. Blush from west to east, blush from east to west, till the west is east, blush it through the west. Rosy is the west, rosy is the south, roses are her cheeks, and a rose her mouth.
It was some months after this that he suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed his right side. I saw him from time to time. He came into London to do a lot of physiotherapy work at a clinic in Finchley Road. His braveness in the middle of this affliction and his cheeriness amidst understandable moments of depression was amazing. In 1984, he appeared as a speaking guest of the Songmaker's Almanac, a program in tribute to him, tracing his life story and even including some of his own early compositions. I'll never forget with what dignified difficulty he walked onto the stage with a stick, and how movingly he recited Schubert's moving monologue with piano accompaniment, Abschied von der Erde. For those of us, young and old, who felt themselves on the borders of society, simply for being different, and who were not yet ready to embrace the confrontational sexual politics of a new age, Britten was a crucial spokesman. His partnership with Pearse an inspiration. It was a nuanced way of defending the position. There were no demonstrations and there was nothing obvious, but for those who knew, those who could read between the lines, there was a continuity and an insistence and a dignity in the right not only to do what we were doing, but to be who we were. The Red House has been named an LGBTQ heritage site, and I understood its symbolic importance as such, even in 1971. But for me, it was mainly a place of musical magic, if also a place of tempests. It was my good luck to meet and sometimes accompany PP, Peter Prospero himself, and also getting to know the even greater wizard, Ben of Britain, who was the co-ruler of the isle full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs, and still that fairest isle, all isles excelling. His achievements, their achievements, made us stand tall in the world of music around the globe. The disembodied oral magic of those Britten recordings heard in the Bayswater bedsit in my teens had turned into something gloriously real and of everlasting value to me. Very few young musicians have ever been so fortunate. One may also say that not many have been near so bright a flame, and despite being singed from time to time, survived to tell the tale. Ben and Peter, we who knew you remember you with great love, and those who didn't know you stretch out their ears, hearts, understanding to you, and thank you for what you have given the musical heritage of this country.